describing the three main types, which were the creatine phosphate system, where phosphate can be added onto ADP from creatine with the help of the enzyme creatine kinase. And then the other two mechanisms we were getting into, but these are the more sustainable mechanisms, right? The creatine phosphate, we said, is only a temporary means of making a small amount of ATP, and small in the sense of comparing it to oxidative phosphorylation and glycolysis, but it's enough ATP at rest to initiate the contractions, right? When I say small amount of ATP. So that is the creatine phosphate system. And then now we're going to start looking at the other two mechanisms and how they play a role when we have more long-term physical activity, depending on the intensity of that activity. So with different types of exercise intensity, and when we say exercise here, we also mean just general everyday work. When we think about exercise of light to moderate intensity, this could be walking, but this could also be things like cleaning, house cleaning, any type of lighter intensity to moderate intensity exercise. And in those scenarios, you can typically maintain your rate of breathing. You can typically maintain respiration. And so the first part of that exercise is going to start with the creatine phosphate. And that is going to give a very short amount or short timing of ATP supply while the other two mechanisms are warming up. So we're going to begin with the creatine phosphate supplying that initially, and then we're going to tap into any glycogen stored. So within the initial period beyond the creatine phosphate supply, we're going to tap into any glycogen stores that are readily available. And then up to 30 minutes, we're going to tap into glucose and fatty acids that are already in the blood. Now, beyond that, we can typically rely on oxidative phosphorylation. So anaerobic glycolysis will play a small role. And again, that is through the process of breaking down glycogen stores and any glucose and fatty acids that are available. But beyond that, what takes over more permanently and more sustainably is oxidative phosphorylation. And the reason for that is because for light and moderate activities, we can typically maintain adequate ventilation, so we can keep oxygen coming in, which is required for oxidative phosphorylation. We typically can increase the heart rate and the contractility of the heart so that we can match with our rate of breathing the supply of muscles for those activities, right? The supply of oxygen demand. And then we can also have other mechanisms like dilating blood vessels to the muscles. This is going to help to shunt more blood towards those skeletal muscles that are in need and helping to bring that oxygen. So because we can maintain these three things with light to moderate intensity activity, we will typically rely on oxidative phosphorylation for those types of activities. There's also a small increase in the GLUT4 receptors, or the transporters rather, that allow glucose to be uptaken into cells. And that is to help us to utilize any of that glucose that is in the blood immediately. Okay, so just coming back to the graph here, we start with creatine phosphate. Then we have anaerobic glycolysis that can help us oxidize any existing sources of glucose or glycogen. And then we predominantly are going to sustain those activities with oxidative phosphorylation as long as we can make the shifts that keep the muscles oxygenated through the rate of breathing, through the contractility of the heart, and through dilating blood vessels. Now, when we look at the heavier intensity exercise, we are going to rely mainly on anaerobic glycolysis, and that is because we're typically not able to match the oxygen demand of muscles to perform these heavier intensity activities with the rate of breathing alone. So now we have to use anaerobic glycolysis where we can make ATP in the absence of oxygen. Okay, just because the oxygen supply is not going to match the demand. So we typically will have lactate build up as a byproduct. All right. We will also be able to make a smaller amount of ATP. So it's not going to be the same amount that we see for oxidative phosphorylation, just because that's going to make a lot of ATP, about 34 per molecule of glucose. And then here we're only making about 2 net per molecule of glucose. So we're not going to see the same amount of energy, but we will be able to supply those muscles without having the oxygen supply. Now, the types of activities that we're talking about here, so heavy lifting, sprinting as opposed to light jogging, just in exercises that require a lot of powerful contractions as well, right? So those types of bodybuilders who do lots of heavy lifting, and that would require more anaerobic glycolysis. I do want to point out, however, that we still start with the creatine phosphate. So just to start the contraction, we're still going to rely on the creatine phosphate system because that's sort of on tap waiting. And then we're going to tap into anaerobic glycolysis as it's much more, sustainable. Now, we can think about the different types of skeletal muscle fibers based upon two factors. One is their velocity of contraction, whether they are fast muscle fibers or slow muscle fibers. And that would be sort of their first name. The second name of the muscle type would be its primary energy source, whether it relies primarily on oxidative phosphorylation or it relies primarily on glycolysis or anaerobic glycolysis. And we can use these classification in order to determine three different types of muscle, which we'll talk about. But let's talk about some more, let's talk more about the criteria here, right? The different naming based upon these muscle types. So when we think about the speed of contraction, we can talk about fast twitch fibers versus slow twitch fibers. How fast are the contractions starting and ending with these types of muscle? Now, this is going to depend on the myosin ATPase activity, which is the ability to cleave and use the ATP that's attached to the myosin head. And so that is the rate limiting step of the muscle contraction, right? The hydrolysis of that ATP so that it can allow for the power stroke and allow for fast cross-bridge cycling. So if we have a fast rate of myosin ATPase activity, we end up having a fast rate of cross-bridge cycling. So we can consider that muscle to be a fast muscle. It's going to initiate contractions faster because it can hydrolyze that energy from ATP faster. Now, we can also think about slow fibers on the other end of the spectrum, which have a slow myosin ATPase activity. So it takes a longer time to cleave that ATP to make that energy readily available to power the power stroke and to bring about cross-bridge cycling. So fast muscles versus slow muscles, depending upon their myosin ATPase rate. We could also think about just generally comparing muscles, their ability to relax faster as well. So fast fibers can contract 2 to 3 times faster, but they can also relax faster as well. And the reason for that is the rate of the calcium ATPase activity. So the calcium ATPase is the pump that is responsible for pumping calcium back into the SR. It's also going to be responsible for ceasing the contraction after we have that cross-bridge period. So if we have a faster rate of calcium ATPase, we can clear that calcium faster and the muscle can not only relax faster, but it can also, or not only contract faster, but it can relax faster. And so slow fibers have a length of contraction that's about 10 times longer than fast fibers. So again, this is just distinguishing between different rates of contraction and relaxation of muscles. So let's compare 3 different types of muscles here. So we have some extraocular muscles. We talked about these as being very small muscles, very delicate types of movements. And not only are they small physically, but they are also fast in their contraction. So extraocular muscles are small, but they're fast in their contraction. which sort of makes sense. It's a smaller fiber, it requires less calcium to power the contraction, and so it's going to have a faster myosin ATPase, faster calcium ATPase. It's going to relax and contract faster. We have the gastrocnemius muscle. So these are the muscles of the calves, the external muscles of the calves, and these are going to have an intermediate rate in terms of their myosin ATPase, about 40 milliseconds or so. And so we can see that they contract a little bit faster than the soleus, but slower than the extraocular muscles, and then same for their rate of relaxation. And then the soleus muscle, this is a really slow muscle. This is one that is deep or underneath the gastrocnemius muscle, also in the calf. But this muscle is more so a postural muscle. It's always contracting while we're standing, walking, right? It's not going to be one of those sort of prime movers, like the biceps or so, but it's going to be more so like the erector spinae muscles, right? The postural muscles that are always contracting. And so they have a long rate of contraction and a slow rate as well of relaxation. So just to compare three different types of muscles. So this muscle, the soleus, can contract for up to 90 milliseconds, right? So very, very slow in its contraction and relaxation. But that can be a bonus, as I just mentioned, right? That can be ascribed to muscles that need to be contracting for long periods of time. So on that basis, we can also think about the muscle's second name. So the first name would be its speed of contraction, either fast or slow. The second name is going to be based on its primary source of ATP production. Does it prefer glycolysis or does it prefer oxidative phosphorylation? So let's start out with fibers that are considered glycolytic. So these are fibers that prefer anaerobic glycolysis to produce most of their ATP. Now, glycolytic fibers are going to have fewer mitochondria because they don't need it, right? They're not reliant on oxidative phosphorylation, which is the site of the mitochondria, happens in the mitochondria. So fewer mitochondria, but on the other end, they have lots of glycolytic enzymes because they primarily need it for glycolysis. They're going to have lots of those glycolytic enzymes and lots of glycogen stores in order to be able to carry out glycolysis anaerobically. They're going to use a little bit of oxygen, so they're considered anaerobic, and they're going to have a large diameter, but be easy to fatigue. So because they have a large diameter, and the reason that they have a larger diameter is because they don't need to have oxygen diffuse. When we look at the oxidative fibers, they're going to be much smaller because they have to have the smaller surface area for the diffusion of oxygen to power their ATP production, which is oxidative phosphorylation. For these fibers, they don't need to have that diffusion. And so they have a large diameter. So if you look at the photo here, the photomicrograph, we can see the large white fibers. These are the glycolytic fibers, all right? And they're white because they don't have mitochondria, they don't have myoglobin, which are needed more for oxidative phosphorylation, and then they have a larger surface diameter. Oh, and then just to mention why they quickly fatigue. So the reason for quick fatigue is the buildup of lactic acid. Because lactic acid is a byproduct of anaerobic glycolysis, these muscle fibers will build up lots of lactic acid, which is going to result in easy fatigue. Now, comparing that to oxidative fibers, these fibers are smaller in diameter. They have lots of mitochondria, lots of myoglobin, which is the storage in the mitochondria. And so they need that in order to have lots of oxygen supply. Again, they have a small diameter, right? Physically just looking at them, because they need to have a smaller diffusion barrier to have oxygen move into these tissues or these cells. They are resistant to fatigue because they don't have the lactic acid buildup. And then they have lots of capillaries. If you look around the perimeter of this fiber, these darker regions here are actually capillaries. And that is because they need lots of capillaries to bring that oxygen as well. So not only do they need to have a small diameter so that the oxygen can diffuse, they need to have a lot of capillary or blood supply to bring that oxygen to the cells themselves. Okay. So that is the difference between oxidative fibers and glycolytic fibers, and basically their preference for ATP production. Now, on that basis, we can think of three skeletal muscle fiber types. We have slow oxidative fibers, which are sort of one end of the spectrum. We have fast glycolytic fibers, which are on the opposite end of the spectrum. And then somewhere in the middle, we have fast oxidative fibers. Okay. Oxidative fibers are typically slow because they can be, because they have that steady supply of oxygen that can sustain longer contractions. Glycolytic fibers are usually fast, all right? Again, because they have a larger fiber diameter, which means more contractions, right? More cross-bridge cycling, more contractions, and they can give powerful contractions or high intensity activities. But in the middle, sort of intermediate, we have fast fibers that are also oxidative, right? They're not as fast as glycolytic, and they're not as slow as slow oxidative. So let's discuss each of these in a bit more detail. So starting off with slow oxidative fibers, these have a low myosin ATPase activity, low or slow, right? They're kind of very slow in their rate of contraction. They have a high oxidative capacity, which means that they rely primarily on oxygen, and so they are aerobic. And in alignment with that, they have lots of mitochondria, they have rich blood supply, so lots of capillaries, they have lots of myoglobin, which is why they appear more red. And if we look at their diameter, they're smaller typically, and they have less tension or force production, and then a small diffusion barrier. So there's a smaller surface area for oxygen to diffuse. Alternatively, they're going to fatigue slowly. All right, so they're not going to fatigue as quickly as our glycolytic fibers, just simply because they don't have lactic acid being built up. Next is the fast glycolytic fibers. So again, on the other or opposite end of the spectrum, these have a high or fast myosin ATPase activity. They have a higher glycolytic capacity, which means they have lots of glycogen being stored and lots of glycolytic enzymes in order to break those glycogen stores down. They have no myoglobin. Again, they don't need to have that being stored, and they appear white for that reason instead of red. They have a larger diameter, so they're thicker, which means that they can produce more force, right? Remember, the thicker the diameter means the more myofibrils in there, means the more cross-bridge cycling, means more force. So larger diameter, and so these muscles can power more force. And then they fatigue rapidly as sort of a consequence for that. So because they can make this ATP power stronger contractions because they have a larger diameter, they're going to build up lactic acid as sort of a price to pay for that. So typically when you are sprinting, heavy lifting, you'll typically feel that burn in the muscle, right? And that burn in the muscle is the lactic acid buildup. And that's going to lead to fatigue, okay? Now, in the middle, we have fast oxidative fibers. So these are sort of intermediate in their rate of myosin ATPase activity. And they also have a high oxidative capacity. So because they're oxidative in terms of their main mechanism of ATP production, they will still produce ATP aerobically. They're going to have myoglobin as well. And they're going to be slow to fatigue, but not as slow as the slow oxidative fibers, right? They're going to be slow in their rate of fatigue, but it's going to be quicker than we see for slow oxidative fibers. And then their diameter is going to be intermediate as well, not as small as slow oxidative and not as large as fast glycolytic. Okay, so really somewhere in the middle is our fast oxidative fibers. They're kind of a blend of the two other types of fibers. Okay, so here's a nice summary table. Again, just a good way to organize this and practice distinguishing the oxidative capacity, for example, would be high with the oxidative fibers. These oxidative fibers are going to also have more capillaries, more mitochondria, more myoglobin, etc. So really be able to block this table out and fill in the features of each based upon your understanding, right? If this fiber is oxidative, what does that mean? It needs oxygen. So it's going to have more mitochondria to supply oxidative phosphorylation. It's going to have more myoglobin to store that. It's going to have more capillaries to bring that oxygen in, etc. So definitely use that as a way to study and